Wonderful. So I think we've given some folks an opportunity to join us today. So I want to do a few housekeeping things while we're getting started. A couple things I wanted to point out to everybody is you'll see at the top of your screen there's a Q&A panel. Use that to put your questions in. I encourage everybody, don't wait until we get to the Q&A section for a couple reasons. You may have forgotten your question being one reason, and for two, get your question in early so that you're at the top of the list when we start going down them. We want to make sure we're able to get to your question that way. So I encourage you to use that Q&A panel. The other thing I like to point out to folks is I know we've had some situations, some folks for their team configurations or whatever else, um, at times they may have, they're not seeing the content overly well. So what I encourage everybody to do, if you're ever having issues with the content, if you look at the top of your screen, there's a little icon, looks like, it's four squares, kind of like an uncolored Windows logo. It's the view button. So you click on view, you click on more options, and you select add shared display. If you have any issue seeing the content, that's what I encourage you to take a look at. So as we move on, let's get you introduced to everybody here that's going to be talking to you today. I'm Heath Madison. I'm our Senior Director of Professional Services at TrustedTech. Anything we do that's proactive in nature, it's my responsibility to make sure you get what you need with a high level of satisfaction. A little bit about me. I've been in tech for over 30 years, and I'll be honest, quite a bit of that's been with VMware. In fact, I have my VCP. I am manager now, so it's a little outdated. My VCP is in version 2.0, but I've been working with the product since it was a beta product back in the late 90s. So I love VMware. I just think what's going on now warrants at least us having a conversation like today's. But I brought some much more relevant and current people than myself on this call. I'm going to start off by handing it over to Lance.
Thanks, Heath. My name is Lance Wade Zunis. I'm the manager for Azure Services and Solutions here at TrustedTech. And although I've got Azure in my title, it doesn't mean I don't have a wealth of experience when it comes to VMware, Hyper-V, all that fun stuff. I lived in and out of data centers for 15 years before I decided to stick my head in the clouds. So I've worked with multiple sites doing replication, getting clients, from Hyper-V to VMware, vice versa, and then ultimately helping them make transitions and migrations into the cloud. So hopefully I can bring some experience when it comes to our folks here considering that decision, and we can bring some good information to the table. And next to me, of course, in the slide is the best looking one of the bunch here, Mitch. Mitch, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lance. Mitch Jones, I'm the dedicated account manager here that works with each and every one of you every single day. Have a breadth of experience over the last decade working with VMware and helping organizations manage their deployments in Azure, Hyper-V, and as well as VMware. So looking forward to going into more detail on what we're going to talk about today.
And he definitely has the best hair out of the bunch.
Yeah. I figured if you took Mitch and combined him with you and I, Heath, I think you'd have about a quarter of a good haircut there.
So let's get started. What are we going to be talking about today? We're going to start out by talking about the state of VMware pricing. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. That's why you chose to join us today. But we're going to kind of give an overview of that and the impact to our customers that we hear when talking with our customers every day. We're going to talk about how Azure PaaS and IaaS can be viable alternatives. We're going to actually show kind of a little bit of the cost modeling, VMware, Azure, or if you want to stay on premise, even a Hyper-V solution. Migration path considerations and pitfalls. Obviously, a lot of folks are looking at migrating, but they may think it's not possible. Well, we've kind of been there, we've done that. So we're going to talk about some of that today. We're going to talk about real world examples of VMware exits that we have helped our customers with. And then we're going to have the Q&A session with the experts today, and we're going to have that conversation with you. While we get started, I wanted to get everybody kind of engaging a little bit. Wanted to ask a quick poll. What hypervisor are you currently using in your organization?
That
And if you
fancy
have,
poll popping up.
I know, and if you have more than one, feel free to select more than one. We knew we'd see a lot of VMware because if you didn't have VMware, you probably wouldn't have been here today. I appreciate all the responses. So feel free to keep answering those questions, but while we're getting started, we're going to go ahead and get moved into the state of VMware pricing and customer impact. And for that, I'm going to hand it off to Mitch.
Absolutely. So let's talk about what's really driving this conversation right now. Now, Broadcom's restructuring of VMware and forced shift to subscription for SKUs. I'm sure everybody's saying yay. The short version is this: the licensing model you've used for years is gone. Perpetual licenses have effectively disappeared, and in their place are bundled subscriptions with higher minimums and far less flexibility. That means even if your workload profile is modest or stable, your baseline cost is going to go up, and your ability to mix and match only the features you need goes down. And the major three impacts that customers are seeing is subscription resets every term. This means prices can increase at renewal, not over a 5 or 7 year life cycle as it did before. SKU consolidation into larger bundles. So you're paying for features you don't use just to access the ones you do, and higher core minimums. This disproportionately impacts small and mid-sized clusters that were formerly right-sized. The business consequence isn't just cost inflation, it's loss of control. And that's the theme you'll hear today. Renewals become unpredictable, budgeting becomes harder, and operationally, VMware becomes something you're reacting to rather than planning around. Now, the good news is that moment creates a rare opportunity. Instead of absorbing these increases, organizations are using this shift as a strategic pivot point, a chance to step back and say, if we're being forced into a new model anyway, does it make financial sense to stay, or is now the time to replatform to something more aligned with how we operate? Now that we've talked about Broadcom's shift to subscription first licensing, let's look how these changes actually show up in your budget. What we're seeing across customers is that VMware's new bundle structure doesn't just raise the price, it raises the floor. You're no longer able to right-size licensing to match the shape of your environment. Instead, you're committing to larger bundles and higher minimums, even when your cluster doesn't need the capacity or those features. For many organizations, that means your run rate goes up simply because the SKU structure changed, not because your business asked for more features or performance. And there's a compounding effect because these are now subscription terms. Your prices reset at each renewal. That could introduce meaningful variability into multi-year budget planning, especially for organizations used to the stability of perpetual licenses. The other impact is feature creep. With consolidation, you're now paying for components you may not need, like advanced automation or operation modules that add cost but don't necessarily map to your workload strategy. This is what we call bundle tax, and it's a major driver behind VMware exits we're seeing. Let's shift from pure cost to risk, because Broadcom's restructuring isn't just hitting budgets, it's creating operational uncertainty. The first risk is renewal instability. Customers are no longer able to plan renewals years in advance because the SKU landscape keeps shifting. Every renewal feels like a renegotiation, and that creates both planning challenges and operational exposure. The second risk is loss of flexibility. You're locked into bundles, as we talked about, locked into minimums, and in many cases, locked into features you didn't choose. That means more of your IT strategy becomes dictated by vendor packaging instead of business needs. Another operational concern we're hearing is around support. With Broadcom's tightening its focus on enterprise scale customers, mid-market organizations are reporting slower support responsiveness and higher reliance on self-service. That's not something you want to be tied to for your organization or infrastructure.
And obviously, we're hearing a lot about this from our customers. That's why we wanted to put this together. I mean, we had a webinar back in December, and VMware got brought up, and the chat was lit up with everybody's happiness with those price changes. So we wanted to make sure we put this together so that we could at least discuss those options. So thanks for that information, Mitch. And I think we're now kind of up to speed for anybody that didn't know. That's kind of a lot of it, and the price increases have been, quite frankly, in a lot of cases, astronomical. But let's start talking about options, and for that, we're going to take it up a notch, and we're going to start talking about kind of what those alternatives could be. So I'm going to hand this over to Lance because you don't want me going into detail on this stuff.
Do my best Emerald impression here and kick it up a
Yeah.
notch for you, Heath. Bam. So we're going to talk about Azure a little bit. That's what I do here. It's what my favorite thing is to talk about. But don't get dismayed if you haven't considered it. We're going to talk about some other options in a little bit here as well. The biggest thing that I want to bring up is everything these days seems to be going to that subscription model or as a service. We've seen it with your TV, with music, even your computer's operating system. I've seen it as far as some car companies are making you subscribe to your heated seats now, an option that's built into your car, but now you have to pay to use it. Very similar to what we're seeing on the Broadcom side with VMware, where now something that you've done for a decade is suddenly locked behind a subscription paywall. When it comes to moving things to Azure, we don't run into those blockers quite as much because we're using things as a service and not necessarily as a subscription. No commitments, nothing like that. But what I always tell people is you don't want to fall into that as hole, the AAS hole, as a service. So what that basically means is you don't want to pigeonhole yourself into being locked into infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. You want to make sure that you have the flexibility to do what makes the most sense for your workload. And that's what makes Azure such a great solution for moving your workloads from on-prem into the cloud, or even going with a hybrid model, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. The most important thing to consider when it comes to where you're going to move things to when you're considering your alternatives is to make sure that you can leverage the platform. Don't let the platform leverage you. And that's kind of what we see happening now with VMware, where you're, kind of not behind the wheel anymore. They're making the decisions for where things are going. And so it's one of the nice things about Azure is that you basically control your spend, you control your workloads, and you build to the workload. You build to the actual utilization of the product instead of having to adapt to how the manufacturer, Microsoft, is doing things for you. So what's that mean when you actually start shifting some of that responsibility? We like to talk about that as the shared responsibility model. This basically means that as you move some of your workloads into the cloud, somebody else is now going to be in charge of doing some of the work. What this means for you coming into Azure is you now basically have unlocked the cheat code to get over 70 data centers that cost like $500+ million each without having to pay to build them. And if you've ever built a data center out or co-location or just renovated a closet to host servers, you know that is not a cheap experience. You're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in HVAC, redundant WAN, redundant power, security. You have to think about the physical security of the environment, where Microsoft has done all of that for you, and they've done it to a scale that most of our clients aren't capable of footing the bill for. And that's one of the really cool things about moving into the public cloud is you've now opened yourself up to take advantage of all of that without having to pay for it, essentially. You don't need to have that capital expense anymore. You just basically turn into an operational expense and it makes life a lot easier. So you get that Fortune 100 capability without having to pay for it all right out of the bat. And one of the really cool things about building in Azure is it's built security first. So everything that Microsoft does with Azure is always thinking security first and then functionality beyond that. So all of your resources are going to be in extremely secure data centers. You have isolation from one workload to another. So even though you're in the public cloud, that doesn't mean that you can, see your neighbor, see what they're doing. Nobody has visibility into each other's workloads. And so Microsoft really has put a lot of effort, or especially over the last, half decade or so, into making sure that they have one of the most secure platforms on the planet. And all of this kind of feeds back into that shared responsibility model. So let's take a real quick look here and see how that exactly looks for most of our clients. Right now, you're probably leaning towards that right side there, on-prem. Everything is your problem, top to bottom, soup to nuts. You've built the facility, you buy the servers, you physically connect them with your networking infrastructure. You have to provide the power, the HVAC, everything. You are responsible for the whole show. When you start migrating workloads into the cloud, your first step is going to be into infrastructure as a service. And what that means is your virtual machines and all that stuff still kind of function like they did on-prem, but now it's no longer your problem having, building the data center, maintaining the hosts, maintaining the network. Your provider takes care of that. In this case, Microsoft with Azure. Modernizing that, taking it a step further, we now have platform as a service, which eliminates the operating system of it all. So no longer are you responsible for maintaining that Windows Server OS and patching 0 days, worrying about exploits, all of that stuff. It's now handled by Microsoft, and they just basically push out the platform for you to build your whatever on. You sometimes need to worry about networking, so you can still kind of network things together, your platform as a service to your infrastructure as a service. The application itself, you'd be required for something like SQL, or an app server like IIS, where we can transition from Windows Server into a platform server for your web apps. And then your accounts and identities, devices and information, the actual data itself, those are your responsibility regardless. But that's the stuff that most of us are really good at. We accumulate the data, we buy the end user compute, and we maintain our user identities. So really, no matter what, you're going to be handling that stuff. Moving from PaaS to SaaS, or software as a service, is about the lowest level of responsibility you can have when it comes to serving up compute over the internet. You're probably already doing something on SaaS if you're doing like Office 365. A lot of QuickBooks installs are SaaS now. A lot of ERP systems, CRM, Salesforce. All of that stuff is software as a service. So chances are you already have some experience and some exposure to those. But for the most part, when it comes to Azure, we're focusing on the IaaS and the PaaS services. And so let's talk about IaaS and PaaS on Azure and why it's kind of a natural fit. And in this case, it has to do with the fact that Microsoft is the platform for everything. It's the Microsoft ecosystem. So when it comes to identity, governance, and security, Microsoft integrates almost every single one of their products across their entire ecosystem with Azure, with Microsoft 365, and they use Entra ID as the foundation of all of that. So chances are you're already leveraging Entra for single sign-on if you're in Exchange Online or SharePoint, OneDrive, anything like that. More than likely, you're already leveraging Entra. And so building in Azure allows you to continue leveraging that as your identity provider. Microsoft then gives you governance control with Azure Policy, management groups at the subscription level. These types of things allow you to build a very controlled environment without a lot of guesswork happening month to month on, where's my security posture? Where's my cost coming from? Who has access to do what? And then finally, from a security standpoint, Microsoft has built out absolute industry-leading controls with Defender for Cloud and Defender XDR over on the Office 365, Microsoft 365 side that allow you to connect all of your workloads together and have kind of a single pane of glass for where your security is at. So really what Microsoft has created with Azure and Microsoft 365 is a single stable ecosystem for oversight and management of everything you do in the cloud. But what if you're not doing things in the cloud? And that's when we start talking about having a hybrid environment. And this is really kind of where most of the clients are leaning towards these days, keeping some stuff on-prem, doing some stuff in the cloud to take advantage of elasticity, which is just the ability for workloads to scale up, down, in, out very rapidly. What Microsoft has pushed out is a product called Azure Arc. And Azure Arc allows you to connect all of these workloads outside of Azure and leverage the Azure single pane of glass for management. So you can have workloads on-prem in AWS, GCP, Alibaba Cloud, your neighbor's basement, wherever you find the space, whatever makes sense. Azure Arc ties all of those together and gives you kind of a single point of oversight and management for all of them. What's the path, though? What are we going to do now that we've identified what our process is? What do we have running? What do we want to do with those workloads? Step one is typically lift and shift. That's where we take workloads as they are in VMware. We move them into Azure or the cloud as they are. It's basically one-to-one. Now, as part of that effort, we do a lot of optimization. We figure out what makes sense to run it in Azure because you're going to find a lot of workloads on-prem are ridiculously oversold. You've kind of built out for your peak demand. And when you're building with bare metal hardware, you don't have the flexibility and elasticity you do in the cloud. So you kind of buy and build to what your peak is going to be like, even though 95% of the time you're probably not utilizing everything that you have out there. And that's one of the great advantages we have with the cloud is we can move towards full modernization and kind of leverage all of the controls and levers that Microsoft has put out there to make sure that we're right sizing our infrastructure, we're taking advantage of cost optimization, and we're really moving the business and the workloads towards, the current and future builds of what is modernization when it comes to our apps. So that being said, I think, Heath, did we want to ask another question just to kind of break up all of my monotonous droning on?
I'm sorry, I was hypnotized by the dulcet tones of Lance Wade Zunis.
I apologize for that.
How did I do after all these years?
Hey,
Have I finally learned to pronounce your last name? How did I
very
do?
close, and I
Oh.
appreciate you bringing that up because everyone's always said I have a face for radio, so thank you for that.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and just kind of, I'm curious where you are on your journey when it comes to this. Um, how far along are you currently in your migrations or kind of any adjustments around VMware?
Yeah, and Heath, we deal with clients day in and day out who are at pretty much every stage in this poll. Not as many that are fully migrated off VMware. And if you're fully migrated off VMware, we appreciate you being here, but the content might not
Yeah.
be the best for you. But it's always fun to look
And,
at the three of us trying to muddy our way through a webinar like this.
right, let's be honest, we're still, and working with those customers every day too. We're just going down different paths. We're talking about optimizing their Azure environments and things like that, so they don't fall into a different kind of hole when it comes to
Yeah.
kind of the sprawl and
Yeah, exactly. And Heath, those are the clients that we're also talking about modernization. And that brings us kind of to the next point here is what can you really do with the cloud? Now that you've lifted and shifted everything, you've moved your workloads over to Azure. Maybe you're still on that hybrid configuration where you're keeping some stuff local. But the next step of that process is to start modernizing. And that's where stuff like containerization and elastic scaling comes into play. You may have heard of Kubernetes or K8s, Kates. That is a very modern term for taking a server workload like IIS, for instance, and turning it into kind of a microserver. So you're stripping back all of the things in the operating system, stuff like, Explorer, all of these random, print servers, all of these things that typically cause those headaches and frustrations as, you're trying to just run a web server, but suddenly, the print spooler is crashing out because somebody printed a 2,000-page notepad document for some reason. So containerization removes all of that overhead and just pushes out what's necessary to make your application run. So that is a very logical step forward. When you've kind of lifted and shifted, you've moved things over as is. Now we start working with clients on what's the future hold. And something that we're going to talk about later today is our migration readiness assessment, which actually does a lot of this planning and assessment for clients, figuring out, well, hey, you're running IIS now and you got the following dependencies. You could migrate that to app service in Azure, take the whole operating system out of the picture. Now you've got this elastic, flexible workload that in some cases is actually cheaper to run than keeping things on traditional infrastructure. And so that's when you can really leverage what the cloud can do. Auto scaling, scale sets, you can build out elasticity up, down, in and out on a schedule or on dynamic utilization, using spot VMs for development for your DevOps. Even stuff like stop start on VMs where, normally a server would be running 24/7 on-prem. You've paid for hardware to run it. You're using it 5% of the time. Shut it down and start it in the cloud automatically. That's kind of the advantage that we have when it comes to flexibility and elasticity. So yeah, I just want to point out, like I said earlier, we didn't really come here to talk all about Azure though. I think we've talked about the pros and cons of moving to the cloud. Let's talk about what it looks like if we decide we're not quite ready for the cloud or we don't want to move everything. We want to stay on-prem. What are our options there?
well, and that's perfect because we did actually have one question in the Q&A like, hey, I want to stay on-prem. Are we going to talk about my options too on this call? And and I responded with yes, we're going to discuss Hyper-V, and there's other options too, right? There's even for Microsoft, if you really like Azure functionality, there's Azure Local. We won't go into too much detail on that one today, just because there are some specific use cases where that may make sense, and that's stuff that we could discuss during any assessment that we may do kind of from a planning stage. But typically, Hyper-V is where a lot of our customers go if they want to stay on-prem. But obviously, there's costs associated with that. So we want to kind of dive into kind of what that looks like when we have VMware, Azure, Hyper-V, all these different options. And now that we're going to start talking about cost, I'm going to ask Mitch to take the reins.
Absolutely. Thanks, Heath. So yes, we will absolutely discuss Hyper-V in a bit more detail, but let's understand the difference in cost across the board. For the bigger picture, the cost model behind each option are shown on the screen because the economics of, let's start with VMware, excuse me, today look fundamentally different than they did 18 months ago. VMware's subscription first model is now heavily driven by per core licensing, mandatory bundles, and multi-year commitments. That means your costs are primarily OpEx, but they're OpEx that's locked in with limited flexibility and very little correlation to your actual workload behavior. Predictability is decreasing, and your exposure to vendor-driven price adjustments is increasing. Azure operates in a completely different model. Instead of bundling features you may not need, Azure is consumption-based. You pay for the VM size you choose, the storage tier you need, and the networking you actually use. If you shut resources down, your cost drops. If you right size, your cost drops. If you apply reservations or savings plans, your cost drops even further. And when you stack Azure hybrid benefit, you're reclaiming value from the Windows and SQL licenses you already own. Hyper-V is an option for many people that want to stay on-prem. Continues to be a CapEx heavy model, however. Windows Server licensing, hardware refresh cycles, storage investments, backup tools, clustering requirements, all these create large periodic spend events. It's stable, which is good for you, but it's rigid. Scaling requires more hardware, not a configuration change. Where customers get the biggest aha moment is when they see the risk profiles side by side as we're showing here. And we'll go into more detail on some Azure predictability and spend. When we talk about Azure costs, a lot of folks ask, what actually moves the number on the invoice? And to people that are new to the Azure side of the house, it can be a lot. This slide breaks down in particular what 5 levers that you can actually control. One, of course, is VM size, the CPU, RAM config, series selection, general purpose, memory optimized, compute optimized, and then we go to storage, premium SSD, standard SSD versus HDD. It's a lot of acronyms.
A lot of acronyms there, Mitch.
It messed with me on that one. Let's go into more detail on our next slide when it comes to talking about Azure hybrid benefit. And we'll talk high level while going into a bit more detail on what you can do to preserve the value of the existing investments, extend server life strategically, avoid renewal shock, and see the financial impact in your spend. Azure Hybrid Benefit is one of the most powerful optimization levers available to organizations moving off VMware, and it's often the one that CFOs get excited about first. This is why. Hybrid Benefit allows you to reuse your existing Windows Server and SQL Server licenses, the ones you've already paid for, when you move those workloads into Azure. Instead of paying for a license included inside Azure VM, you remove the portion and the cost entirely. You're only paying for the raw compute. Then you can stack reservations or savings plans on top of that, which reduces the remaining compute cost even further. So you're combining license reuse with long-term discounts, which create a compounding effect on your total cost of ownership. Then another major consideration is extended security update, or ESUs as they're commonly called. If you're running older Windows Server versions that are out of support, ESUs are provided free when those workloads run in Azure. That eliminates the forced upgrade pressure and avoids the steep cost of buying ESUs for on-prem environments. This is incredibly valuable for organizations planning a staged or partial VMware exit. You can migrate workloads into Azure without being forced to replatform immediately, and you can keep them secure while you modernize on your timeline. When we run a TCO model, Hybrid Benefit typically provides the single largest cost reduction. In several scenarios that we'll talk through later, Hybrid Benefit alone accounted for double-digit savings over 3 years. Before we even layered in right-sizing, or reservations. This is one of the key reasons Azure consistently wins financially when compared to against VMware renewals. And now we're going to hand it over to Lance to go over the current state of licensing and what works moving identity gaps.
I appreciate that, Mitch. And I do just want to point one thing out on those hybrid benefit licensing. Something to think, you're mixing CapEx with OpEx, so you have an upfront cost. The average break even is about a little under 12 months on hybrid benefit, just to throw a rough number out there. So if a client's running a workload in Azure for more than a year, it makes so much sense to look into hybrid benefit, because you will absolutely be saving money usually within a year of buying that license up front. So just some number to throw out there just for fun. So yeah, we're talking about Hyper-V, pricing variables, licensing. Really, ultimately, you're going to look at kind of what you have now running in VMware, which typically is going to be like Windows Server Standard. And with that license, you can run 2 VMs under the operating system in Hyper-V. In some cases, clients may need to upgrade to Server Data Center, which is more expensive, but there's no cap on the number of VMs running. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but as part of our VMware migration readiness assessment, we work through all of this licensing stuff with clients. So you'll know kind of going into your decision what sort of upfront costs you'd be looking at if you want to stay on-prem. So if you want to go ahead and migrate, everything from VMware over to Hyper-V, in some cases, you're good to go. You may not need to have any extra licensing purchased. Otherwise, each one of your hosts would more than likely just need its own Windows Server Data Center license. And in most cases, clients are able to reuse the hardware that they're running VMware on now. But in some cases, that hardware might be 5, some cases 10 years old. So having that hardware refresh cycle considered is something that we really want to talk about, because it is getting more expensive. It's gotten more expensive from yesterday to today, and tomorrow hardware is going to be more expensive again. I just saw a Reddit post this morning. Client was looking for a SAN, priced it last week and came back to buy it this week. It's $20,000 more expensive. Nothing hardware-wise has changed. They didn't double the RAM or add more storage. It's the exact same hardware. It's just now scarcity coming into play, and it's suddenly more expensive. And so that's something we really need to make sure we consider when we look at TCOs, 3 to 5 year refresh cycles. When it comes to staying on-prem, depending on your configuration, when it comes to storage and networking, there may be some extra licensing considerations. A lot of clients are doing storage spaces direct to take advantage of storage pools, additional high performance storage off NVMe and all this really cool, fast stuff. But there's licensing considerations for that. We just want to make sure that you walk into that decision with as much info as possible. And then, of course, DR, BC, we want to make sure we're planning for that. Clients are probably using something third party, something like Veeam or Datto. All of that works, looks, plays totally fine with Hyper-V. But in some cases, we may want to look at alternatives to cut costs even further, stuff like Azure Site Recovery, or Hyper-V replication, building out a smaller backup cluster. But again, you're still talking about a capital expense upfront to build all of that out. So there are a lot of pitfalls when it comes to staying on-prem. But as part of our process going through our assessment with clients, we're hopefully going to be able to identify all of those so that you can make the most informed, best decision possible for what your workload should look like post VMware once you finally get out of there. That being said, let's talk a little bit about what these scenarios actually look like. We've put 3 together here. This is from, basically clients that we've worked with. We've generalized things a little bit. Obviously, we can't go into specifics, but looking at 3 kind of common scenarios. So looking specifically at a client that's moved to Azure. This is a client that got their renewal cost for VMware. The sticker shock was apparent. We had some trauma bonding together as we were kind of building things out, because it's not the first time we've seen it. It's not the last time we're going to deal with it. And this is what we'd call a good size cluster, is 8 to 12 hosts, between 150, 250 VMs. And they were on a 3-year kind of hardware refresh cycle for their existing hardware. So we did a TCO for them. It was going to be prohibitively expensive to stay on VMware. We considered Hyper-V, but because, they were looking at that 3 to 5 year cost. We'd be looking potentially 2 refresh cycles and the rising cost of hardware. It made a lot more sense to make the plan to shift some of those workloads into Azure. We were able to create a wave-based policy for them. The project took 2 months or so. They had time, so they weren't up against a immediate renewal. But ultimately, their TCO came down with Azure because we were able to right-size resources. We were able to utilize a lot of cost control levers that we work with clients on. Working with clients on our Trusted Advisor program, for instance, where you basically have a Azure optimization expert available, allows clients to make sure you're constantly doing the right thing when it comes to cost in Azure, as well as security and governance too. But ultimately, we were able to put that client into a much lower monthly cost, especially over 3 to 5 years when you factor in refresh cycles. Now, what about clients that want to kind of do best of both worlds, the hybrid approach? Very, very common. In this case, what we do with clients is we take their mission critical resources and we move them into Azure right away. That allows us to start sort of scaling down the VMware footprint on-prem, and then we will kind of carve out a Hyper-V cluster from that hardware. This client reused their existing hardware, so there was no expense for any additional servers or storage or anything like that. And as we moved resources into Azure, it freed up the space to basically transition off of the VMware hardware into Hyper-V. And then once everything was moved over, we were able to convert the remainder of their hardware to additional Hyper-V hosts. So they had the on-prem DR that they were looking for with local failover, but then we extended their environment out into Azure to provide that kind of what if we lose our main site for an extended period of time. Business operations can continue this way, and you're looking at a pretty minimal expense on Azure, especially when you think about something like Azure Site Recovery, where you're basically paying to replicate your entire infrastructure out, but really the only cost is very cold, cheap storage. So you're talking hundreds of dollars a month to low thousands of dollars per month, versus some Azure builds when you lift and shift everything, we're touching 5 figures plus a month. But we want to make sure that we choose the right option for the client. And we have another client that we worked with that we call it underutilized clusters. The client had built to peak demand. We kind of talked about this earlier. They were very underutilized on storage. They had planned for rapid scaling and growth, and it either just didn't happen or it wasn't necessary. The client was looking at 6+ figures of hardware refresh coming up, plus the cost of VMware licensing. So the decision for that client was very easy. We moved them into a very elastic model in Azure, built out some scale sets, allowed them to get their baseline running fully optimized. But then we revisit it once a year with them and make sure are we doing things right? Break it down into monthly reviews as well. Are we missing any advantages that Azure offers? New stuff. Our job is to keep up with Azure. It changes every day. Your job is to run your business as best you can. So that's why a lot of clients kind of lean on us for that updated information. We help you make an educated decision once you do end up pulling the trigger on that migration, so you're getting the most value possible, regardless of which option you choose. No matter what, all 3 scenarios, the client saved a bunch of money, and we made a new friend. So that's always a huge advantage, because we're here to make friends, right? That's the goal, right, Heath?
That's what we're all about. Trusted friends. But no, that's great information. And I know there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A about our discussing on-prem solutions. So obviously we talk about Hyper-V. That's one solution that is probably the single most common with our customers. We don't go into as much detail about that because you're used to what it's like to have to buy on-premise hardware. You're familiar with that if you're on VMware today. So what I can comment on there is we can work with you on that, and that's part of our assessment. Actually helps identify what makes sense. And if you have a business driver that is, I'm a manufacturing company that does that does government work and needs to stay on-prem for 90% of our solutions, we have a solution for that, and that's Hyper-V. And we can do V2V migrations and move them out of VMware and into Hyper-V, and it works. We aren't discussing as much today because, as I mentioned earlier, it's nuanced situations, and where with Hyper-V you can quite often, as Lance mentioned, repurpose the hardware that you were currently using on VMware. Azure Local exists too, which gives you a lot of the functionality and flexibility of Azure on an on-prem solution. But chances are you're not going to be able to reuse your hardware because there's a very specific hardware set that's allowed for that. But those are definitely things we can talk about if they're of interest to you when we get to the next stage of the conversation. We're very familiar in all of those options, and we can kind of really go into what makes sense for you. So, but moving beyond that, what I really want to kind of get us to is talking about kind of some of the migration path considerations and pitfalls. And I'm going to go ahead and throw up our last polling question today, and that is just simply, when is your renewal cycle for VMware looking at? That kind of lets us know from a timing standpoint how pressed you are to get stuff going. And we're going to just keep moving right along for the sake of time while you guys answer those questions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it off to
Me. Hi,
there you
it's me
go.
again.
Thanks. It's
I'm the
Lance
problem.
again.
It's me. Yeah. Not to quote
I
my
should
girl
have
T
just guessed.
Swift, but yeah. Uh, we're just gonna real quick hit on some of the methods that we use to get clients off of VMware. We talked about it earlier. Lift and shift is the primary mechanic that we have. It's quick, it's planned, it's executed basically to a very specific goal of getting your resources moved from your current VMware environment into Azure or into Hyper-V as quickly as possible. We have specific tools and tooling that we use to execute this. We try and make life as easy as possible. So that is our primary option. But the thing is, lifting and shifting, you're basically just moving things as is from one place to another. You're not taking advantage of modernization. And that's really the goal for clients is we want to get things from one platform to another, whether that be Hyper-V or the cloud. We don't want to then just fall right back into complacency of having things, it's fine, let's just move along. That's when we modernize. And we can modernize in Azure, we can modernize on-prem. One of the main drivers for this is what application you're running. What's the workload? SQL, IIS. A lot of these apps benefit hugely from containerization. So we talked about that earlier. You eliminate the operating system. You have this little tiny flexible container, and then you can throw as many of them as you want at the workload as needed, start them, stop them, blow them away, whatever you want to do with them. We typically work with clients during our assessments to plan out the lift and shift, the initial move. Depending on what your time frame is, we can execute that rapidly. So, if you need out of VMware by April 1st, we're your guy, we'll make it happen, or we'll at least help you plan out the process so you don't do something wrong. Because the last thing you want to do is get this started, shut something off, and then nothing turns back on again. So we try and identify those gaps and dependencies. But once we've got clients moved into their chosen platform, then we start the process of modernization. Because if you're going to move on to a modern platform, why not take advantage of what it can do? And so, getting onto platform as a service resources in Azure, or containerizing on-prem, or even doing, AKS in Azure to orchestrate all of that stuff. These are all options that we explore with our clients to make sure that we establish that roadmap, both for the short-term move, but then to make sure that you're leveraging whatever platform you move to its maximum value. So some of the mistakes that people make. The worst thing that we run into is clients who skipped step zero. Step zero is plan. You want to make sure that you've got a good plan because what is it? Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. This process will absolutely punch you in the face if you don't know what to expect. And that's kind of where we come into play. Step one, we assess. After we've planned, we assess. We make sure we know what's in place. We don't want to miss something that as we start to move ends up being a problem after the fact. And then we want to make sure that we plan out again for the short term and the long term. What's it going to look like tomorrow? What's it going to look like 6 months from now? and we work with clients to build a predictable roadmap as this process continues. And ultimately, we want to build the foundation first. We want to build to the desired end state. So we think about what's this look like in 12 months, and that's what the foundation looks like to build on top of. Now, part of that, though, of course, is establishing your baselines, looking at, where things are versus where they're going to be. And this is why planning matters, because we want to build the foundation first. We look at identity, networking, and security. And I always look at this as, we're going to launch a ship, right? We're building a new ship. We got to name it so it's unique and everyone knows it's our ship. We own it. We want to make sure it's got a plotted course so it knows where it's going. That's the networking of it all. We don't want to run into any issues, bump into another boat along the way and sink, or an iceberg, because ships, even though they're built really well, they still sink. And then we want to control our security. We want to make sure we plug any holes in the hull before we set sail so the ship doesn't sink along the way. The biggest part of our assessments, I think, that benefits our customers is our dependency mapping. That lets us go through and really look at an application or a workload and what is required to make it run, so that if we move it from one platform to another, everything it needs is going to be there existing once we start it back up, do a cutover, whatever the process is. And then we always look at licensing implications. This is where something like Azure Hybrid Benefit comes into play, or your existing licensing posture with Hyper-V could be advantageous in that you don't need to buy any additional licensing. And then, of course, we optimize. We support our clients after the fact. We offer Trusted Advisor for our clients that are in the cloud to have a reliable, on-demand resource available to support cost, security, and governance in Azure. But then just to be there as kind of a shoulder to cry on of, hey, we're thinking about doing this. It's going to cost too much. What other options do we have? So we become that trusted advisor for our clients in the cloud. But even if they stay on-prem, we still want to make sure that 12+ month roadmap is established. And we do that as a part of our existing assessment. But let's pivot real quick. Let's talk about what some of the concerns are that we're hearing from clients. And so I'm going to hand it off to Mitch just to go over some of the things he's hearing in his day-to-day calls.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, 3 out of 4 of you are here today because you're aware of these changes and are looking into options for you. So what have I heard is time. We're just going to go like for like on the licenses we have. We don't have time to migrate our resources. This is one of the most common one. However, if you just choose to go with what you're doing, you're not going to be set up for success, but you should partner with somebody that can actually help and assess where you're looking to go in the future. Second is the system's complexity. Between Microsoft's native migration tooling and our certified expertise across Microsoft, we're able to help you navigate the complexity of this. And third is budget constraints. And to be honest with you, when it comes to budget, you're going to pay more with VMware. You all know that. However, with M365 and Azure cost optimization services that Lance has been talking about, we can help and modernize your environment as well as optimize moving forward with cost saving mechanisms such as Azure reservations, and savings plans. Lastly, VMware is better than Microsoft. A few years ago, that may have been true, but today Microsoft's ecosystem, Azure Hyper-V, AKS, is a fully mature and highly capable of many environments. And the last one is risk and compliance. Azure meets enterprise-grade security and major compliance standards, giving you strong and aligned foundation across your organization. So every concern is solvable. It's just a matter of partnering with the right people to do that. And what we're seeing is people just like you, SMB and mid-market environments, primarily are the ones that are coming to us, the ones that don't necessarily have 50 engineers or IT departments or $1 million budgets that they can, that they can assume the increased spend. What are some of your pain points that we're hearing? We're dependent on VMware for everything. We don't have a plan B. That's exactly why you're here to talk about that. We bought perpetual licenses and now we're being pushed into a subscription SaaS model anyway. You are, but you're able to predict your spend moving forward a lot easier. We're required to buy solutions, not products. Broadcom simplified bundled SKUs, which sound nice, but for many of you, it means paying for features they don't need, which has been a reoccurring theme in what we're talking about today. Pricing increases are hitting a point where continuing on VMware doesn't make financial sense. This is something that I hear too much when it comes to assessing their renewal prices, and why, again, you're here today possibly. And service quality feels like it's slipping for non-enterprise customers. And that is very true. If you are not one of the large organizations, you will fall by the wayside when it comes to support with VMware. And to talk about some of the solutions, Lance will touch on that.
Yeah, just real quickly, the best thing that we can do for our clients is give you your options, highlight where the gaps are, figure out what the migration plan is, the roadmap, and just give you real information about what it's going to cost you to get from point A to point B and get away from VMware onto the platform of your choice. We're going to give you info on Azure, whether that be Azure Native or AVS, whichever direction you want to go. We can talk about Azure Local, and we can definitely talk about Hyper-V, because that is a very viable play for clients that either want to stay on-prem or are looking at modernizing into the cloud while still leveraging some of that DR capability that you've already paid for in your hardware. And beyond that, we're going to talk about how to make this easy, how to have somebody come in and basically just do the work for you, tell us what the desired end state is, snap your fingers, and we make it happen. So ultimately, we want to get you away from a platform that is kind of holding you hostage and open the doors up to what the potential is moving forward. But the first step for that is figuring out what's actually there and what is the plan. And in this case, I think Heath is the man with the plan. So tell us how we can help moving forward, Heath.
So you've heard Lance bring up the migration readiness assessment, and I'm going to actually ask us to shift to the next slide because there's a link on there so you can get scheduled for that. I can talk through this assessment while folks are able to then click the link. I know there's some people that'll have a hard stop here at the top of the hour. So what our VMware migration readiness assessment is just what we've been talking about. We're going to take a look at your environment. We are going to kind of help you come up with a plan and what it looks like. Now, I will be very transparent with everybody. Our VMware migration readiness assessment, we do for only $2,500, but it actually does get even better than that. If you choose to have us do any work that comes out of it, we will credit up to 20% of any follow-on work. So ultimately, if you do a $12,500 project with us after this migration readiness assessment, you won't pay a dime for the migration readiness assessment. So there is a way to get it completely free. Other things we'll take a look at is what is Microsoft maybe willing to help pay. We hold every Microsoft solution designation, so we have calls constantly to see what's available for funding for you, for us to give to you, and then we don't honestly care where the money for a migration project comes from. If Microsoft wants to give it to us, we'd actually prefer it. So click this link, and that way you have more budget to spend elsewhere. So our readiness assessment, feel free to click that link, get signed up. Someone's going to reach out to you very quickly, at least learn more about it. Here's where we can talk about that advanced on-premise question we had, where you really want to go deep into how you can keep it on-premise. We can do that as part of your readiness assessment. We can have conversations. Obviously, we sell a lot of Windows Server licenses too, if they're necessary, and we can help you get very beneficial to you pricing on some of those as well. So we go deep in all that. But I wanted to make sure we did have some time for some questions here. And so we talked about the on-premise ones. We tried to answer some of the way. Just so everybody knows, you will get a copy of this recording after the session. Here's one. Can Windows servers and Azure authenticate via Entra?
Yes. Yep. You can hybrid join as well, so you can still be connected to a domain as well as using Entra for your identity to sign in. All of that is done via native extensions in Azure. Pretty easy to set that up.
Wonderful. That was a quick one. What about a hybrid of lifting and shifting from on-prem to the cloud, then using the on-prem as the new local failover?
Yep.
So if primary Azure fails?
Yeah, we set that up all the time, depending on how you want to configure things. A lot of clients use their existing hardware for kind of local file caching with Azure File Sync. That gives you super high performance files already synced locally. the internet goes down, you can still do your job day in, day out. And then once it's back up, everything just sinks its way back out to Azure. So we can absolutely make sure that we still leverage that hardware that you paid for, and give it kind of a second life beyond being your primary hosting facility.
Wonderful. We also kind of touched about this a little bit. Is it possible advanced follow-up discussion on on-premise when server 2025 Hyper-V features, upgrades, patches released when and how, move from VMware to Hyper-V, address uptime, active seamless failover and load balance? Yes, there's some of that can be part of the VMware migration readiness assessment that will have that conversation. And we'll even be happy to kind of chat with you while we're planning out that migration readiness assessment. If there's any immediate questions you have before getting into the assessment, we can go deeper on any of those topics you want. Anybody have any other?
Keith, I do just want to note too that we've got experts on my team, both in Azure and in Hyper-V. So if there's discussions you want to have about, that initial build out of a Hyper-V cluster in conjunction with running the migration readiness assessment, more than happy to have those conversations while we're executing the assessment as well.
We ultimately are here to support you and meet you where you need to be. And we'll try to make some recommendations on the way, what we feel is in your best interest. Ultimately, it's your infrastructure. We're not here to tell you how you have to deploy your infrastructure. We're here to hear you, make recommendations based on our expertise and experience, and then kind of help you down a path of whichever makes sense for you. Did we get, we got through all the questions. Does anybody have any follow-ups? Or I know we're at the top of the hour. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Well, I hope everybody found some value in this last hour you spent with us. I know we enjoy talking about this stuff. It's very exciting to us, and we like seeing how we can help our customers. It's one of those win-win-win scenarios that we all like to get to. So thank you so much
Michael
for your
Scott.
time today.
That's right. Always win-win-win.
You got me, Lance. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's not easy to carve an hour out. I look forward to talking to you in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great rest of your week.